Hello, I am Congresswoman Barbara Lee, and I represent California's beautiful 13th Congressional District. Thank you to the Costs of War Project for inviting me to join you for this very important conversation. Today, yes, we are all focused on Afghanistan. Just last week, we lost 13 United States service members and many Afghan allies and children as a result of a terrorist attack. It's heartbreaking, and my prayers and condolences are with their loved ones and all of those impacted. It's crucial that we continue our evacuation efforts and provide humanitarian support to the people of Afghanistan. It is also critical that we understand how we got to this point, as well as the true financial and human costs of the past 20 years of war. Now, 3 days after 9/11, when Congress voted to authorize military force in response, of course, you know I could not vote for this. I voted no because I fear the consequences of giving the president, any president, open-ended power to use military force anywhere against anyone or any nation. Those consequences have been devastating. Trillions of dollars and almost 1 million people killed directly as a result of the post-9/11 wars. I would like to acknowledge the important work Costs of War is doing to document the unacknowledged costs of our post-9/11 wars and how important this research is in our fight to end forever wars. This includes my bill to cut $350 billion from the Pentagon's budget in order to reinvest in human needs, which your research cites. Thank you again to the researchers, advocates, and everyone here today for all of your very great work. Keep up the fight. Let's fight for peace and justice and security.
I'm Murtaza Hussain. I'm a national security reporter for the Intercept, and I'm your moderator for this event this morning. I've been a reporter for about 8-9 years for the Intercept, and much of my focus of coverage has been on the cost of wars on the ground and human impact, political impact, devastation to communities, impact on veterans in the United States. And this event, coming nearly 20 years after 9/11 and the beginning of the post-9/11 forever war conflicts, is an attempt to recap and gain some sort of accounting of the overall costs, both economic and human, of these conflicts. This live stream is hosted by the Cost of War Project, housed at Brown University's Watson Institute and Boston University's Pardee Center. The project was launched over 10 years ago by a group of scholars and experts to document the unacknowledged costs of the post-9/11 wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere. This event is to present and discuss the project's updated estimates of the true budgetary and human costs of the post-9/11 wars and grapple with the broader impact of the past 20 years of war. For those listening and watching, I encourage you to hit retweet and share if you're on Facebook or Twitter. Please spread this event widely. It's coming live and available for people to comment and give questions later on. I think it's very, very important, and I'm glad we're doing this event today. That's obviously reaching a turning point in the 9/11 wars, not just the 20 years after the attacks initially and the events that came after, but of course there are grave events taking place in Afghanistan today, which really put a exclamation point on exactly how dismal these conflicts were, how terrible the impacts have been on Afghans and Americans and Iraqis and others who suffered through them, and finally, how little we've actually gotten in exchange for the massive costs that we've laid out, both economically and in terms of the loss of life, both American and otherwise, since these wars began. And I want to shift then to Dr. Neta Crawford, who will give a presentation on the updated estimates on the 20 years of cost of war. Brown University's Cost of War Project has done previous reports giving their status updates on how much the war's cost so far, how many people have been killed so far directly by violence. But now, 20 years nearly to the date of 9/11, we have updated figures which Dr. Crawford is ready to present right now.
Thank you, Murtaza. I appreciate your work. Anniversaries recall beginnings. A year from now, we will likely be recalling the fall of Afghanistan and the evacuation of 123,000 people. As Ralph Ellison wrote, "The end is in the beginning and lies far ahead." He was perhaps echoing T.S. Eliot's phrase, "What we call the beginning is often the end, and to make an end is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from." On 9/11, the beginning, and in the days and weeks after, about 3,000 people were killed and many thousands more were injured as a direct consequence of the Al-Qaeda attack. Many still suffer from the smoke they inhaled when they rushed to help and the trauma that they experienced as the witnesses and family members of those who were harmed. Blood and treasure. It often seems easier to focus on one or two facts, sometimes in isolation as a stand-in for the whole, like those figures of speech, what poets call synecdoche, where an aspect of a thing, a part, is used to represent the entirety of something much more complex. So presidents say, blood and treasure, that the cost of war is the amount of money that Congress authorized the Pentagon, or the number of US soldiers who died, become a stand-in for the human toll, the blood and treasure. But words fail us in grief. Numbers mystify rather than edify when they become very large. No single number or set of numbers can convey the reality of 9/11 or the events that followed, the world we have made, the paths we chose, the processes we put in place, the things we did not do because we were at war. But we can say a few things after 20 years that can help us see through the fog of war, of preparing for war, of the aftermath of war, to understand its far-reaching costs and consequences. When Congress passed the authorization for the use of military force on the 18th of September, 2001, just a few days after the Al-Qaeda attack, the World Trade Center was still burning and the world was uncertain about the death toll. Many Americans were afraid and angry. Fellow citizens were suddenly suspect because of their accents, their faith, and their scarves. Many wanted revenge and were convinced that the best way to prevent a future attack was to go abroad and get them before they got us. We were also convinced that we needed better security in the homeland to screen every airline passenger and inspect every container that entered the country, to increase electronic surveillance, and convinced that we even needed to restrict our speech lest it seem unpatriotic. The Cost of War Project, which began publishing reports more than a decade, dozens of scholars who have contributed analyses, many papers that have given us focused snapshots on the paths we took and their consequences. These scholars and experts have shown us that the global war on terror has been truly global. As we can see from the map produced by Dr. Stephanie Savell of the Cost of War Project, the work she did with others found that there were counterterror operations in dozens of countries involving combat, military exercises, training, and assistance. The project is releasing information today, part of a 2 years long effort to mark the 20 years of war since 9/11. Today, we're updating our estimate of the long-term cost of the post-9/11 wars in terms of lives lost, money already spent, and what the US is likely to spend in the future. But the wars are more than locations on a map and numbers. The war on terror has taken a great toll in human life. Afghanistan and Iraq are the major war zones, of course, but hundreds of thousands have been killed in Pakistan, Syria, Yemen, and other places where the US has been fighting. For example, all told, about 176,000 people have been killed in Afghanistan since 2001 by all parties, and another 67,000 in Pakistan in related fighting. In Afghanistan, civilians are about a quarter of those killed. In Pakistan, more than a third of those killed have been civilians. The war in Iraq has taken more than 275,000 lives. And since late 2014, the war in Syria has killed almost as many people. In Iraq, about 2/3 of those who are killed are civilians. But these numbers are estimates. Counting civilians killed in such large numbers is both difficult and controversial. The people in the war zones often say that those killed were counted as militants, but they were actually children and family members. Moreover, while our reports focused on the civilians killed by bombs, bullets, fire, and shrapnel, we've not been tracking indirect death. That is, the people who die because they lack safe access to drinking water, medical care, or food because the war has made the farming that they need to do to live much more difficult or even impossible. We don't count indirect death because it is too difficult to estimate. Costs also include the count of Afghan and Iraqi military and police and militants killed and injured. But those are sometimes themselves fudged or even omitted because people don't want to admit how many people were killed on their side. And they may not know how many killed were on the other side. In a measure of our concern, we do know a very precise number of how many American military have been killed in the post-9/11 war zones. The Pentagon updated their figures yesterday to 2,325 people killed in Afghanistan since the war zone, in that war zone since the war began. 130 people have been killed in other war zones related to that. Another 4,598 have been killed in operations in Iraq. The analysis of Jason Davidson for the project shows that US allies, Canada, and the UK suffered a higher percentage of fatalities than the US did in Afghanistan. The numbers killed would be much higher, but the Pentagon has made enormous strides with battlefield medicine. More than 50,000 service members have been wounded in the post-9/11 wars. But because of advances in battlefield medicine, survivability has increased to more than 90%. On the other hand, the work of Ben Suit for the project shows that Pentagon and the VA have done much less well at counting soldiers and veteran suicides. Suit found that 30,000 active duty and veterans have taken their lives, post-9/11 war veterans. But there's not just blood. The work of David Vine and his colleagues has shown that many millions have been displaced, pushed out of their homes by war, refugees inside their own countries or outside them, moving from Afghanistan and Pakistan to Iran, Europe, the United States, moving from Iraq to Syria, from Syria to Lebanon, fleeing Somalia and Libya, hoping to find peace and safety. If we focus now on treasure, it is possible to estimate that what the federal government has or is likely to spend through FY 2022 and the future costs of care for veterans, not including the costs for state and local governments of Homeland Security for the moment. The costs break out into Pentagon war spending for the counterterror wars, related DoD spending driven by war, that is, increases to the Pentagon's base budget. There's Homeland Security spending related to counterterrorism, spending by the State Department and USAID, and the cost of veterans care to date. And then, of course, there's the future costs of veterans care, medical care, and disability. And finally, there's interest on the borrowing that occurred because the US never raised taxes or encouraged people to buy war bonds in large numbers. Thus, while the US was in budget surplus in 2001, we've gone into budget deficit since then. Transparency on these numbers waxes and wanes. The DoD has never passed an audit. For some years, Homeland Security spending on counterterrorism has not been explained clearly by the Office of Management and Budget or by DHS. One notable trend, however, has been the growth in the entire Pentagon budget. While war spending has increased and decreased, the base military budget has grown in nearly every year of the last 20. Every year but one. This includes spending that was in part driven by war, for instance, the large pay increases given to troops in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, the increased cost of their healthcare over the last 20 years, which has gone up about 20%. Bonuses for enlistment and re-enlistment, and the purchase of new weapons, and the maintenance of bases as well that might not otherwise have been bought or maintained. These are enormous costs, nearly $6 trillion already spent, and then there's future spending for veterans. Professor Linda Bilmes is here, and I'll let her explain why we care for veterans in coming years. But that is not all. The work of Heidi Peltier for the project shows that military spending is not as productive as other forms of spending. For every $1 million spent on the military, it could have provided many more jobs in healthcare, education, and construction. Further, Peltier shows that large chunks of military spending now go to contractors who make high profits and don't always, at least according to the special inspectors of Afghanistan and Iraq reconstruction, do high quality work. Sometimes the things that they promise are not even built. Finally, there is an enormous environmental toll. The wars have led to deforestation as people on the move search for food, have devastated wildlife, and the wars have increased US military greenhouse gas emissions. Those emissions were declining at the end of the Cold War and declined significantly. Then, as you can see from this chart, I don't know if you can actually see from the chart, but the uptick in the middle is the increase following the onset of the post-9/11 wars. And the emissions track US operations in the war zones. So they go up and down depending on what's going on in the war zones. So those emissions are larger in any one year than many countries. Pentagon emissions, for example, last year were about the size of the entire emissions of the country of Denmark, one of the United States allies in Afghanistan. These emissions will be in the atmosphere for many years, long after these wars have ended and the last veterans and survivors of these wars have died. The end is in the beginning and lies far ahead. Murtaza, you're muted.
Oh, apologies. Thank you, Dr. Crawford. There's very sobering statistics and framing of this event and this report. Just to add, Dr. Crawford is the author of Accountability for Killing, a Moral Responsibility for Collateral Damage in America's Post-9/11 Wars. It's an excellent book. I highly recommend checking it out. And I really appreciate Dr. Crawford and others in the Cost of Wars Project as a reporter trying to put some context and give some sort of big picture perspective of events that as reporters and even as people trying to experience these conflicts and document them, they seem so massive, and the scope of them is so profound that it's very difficult to get that large perspective. So reports like this and studies like this and events like this, which touch upon other aspects like the climate impact and the impact of migration, forced migration through violence, they provide some way of putting a frame on events which are just so large and so daunting that it's impossible for any individual to do otherwise. So with that, we'll get into a panel discussion. We have several excellent panelists, and for those listening or watching on the live stream, I encourage you to tweet or email questions for Dr. Crawford and other panelists, and they'll be answered later in the live stream. So our first panelist is Dr. Linda Bilmes, who teaches public policy and public finance at the Harvard Kennedy School and is the former Assistant Secretary and CFO of the U.S. Department of Commerce. She is a United States member of the United Nations Committee of Experts and is co-chair of Economists for Peace and Security. In 2008, she co-authored The $3 Trillion War with Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, and she's written extensively about the cost of caring for war veterans. Dr. Maha Hilal is a researcher and writer on institutionalized Islamophobia and author of the forthcoming book, Innocent Until Proven Muslim, Islamophobia, the War on Terror, and the Muslim Experience Since 9/11. She's also co-director of Justice for Muslims Collective, where she focuses on political consciousness and narrative shifting. And finally, Catherine Lutz is co-founder and co-director of Cost of War and the author of Homefront, A Military City and the American 20th Century and the Basis of Empire. So to begin with, I want to ask a question for Linda. We've just heard these massive numbers in Dr. Crawford's presentation. They're numbers that are so enormous, whether the death tolls or the economic figures tabulated for the cost of the post-9/11 conflicts, that they're very difficult to wrap our heads around. We're talking about trillions of dollars, money which exceeds the annual GDP of the United States in any given year, and put over 20 years of expenditure and all the government effort, and as Dr. Crawford mentioned, the opportunity cost as well too, which is incalculable of this money spent. Dr. Bilmes, I want to ask you, how do we put these numbers in context? And further, given your own area, especially in research, there are long-term costs which are attributed today but not yet incurred for the cost of caring for veterans created by these wars. Can you tell us, how do we make these numbers real, and how do we put them in a context which lets us appreciate how much has been expended economically on these wars?
So thank you, Murtaza. I'm Linda Bilmes, and I'm going to make a couple of points about the issues facing American veterans. But first, let me just call attention to the magnitude, to the scale of this number. Dr. Crawford said that the cost, as tracked by the excellent Cost of War project, is now $8 trillion. But it's easy to forget the scale because of the fact that $1 trillion is, in the English language, rhymes with million and billion. So I usually explain to my students ways to visualize $1 trillion. And one way to visualize just the scale of that number is that if you had a $1,000 bill, $1 million would be 4.3 inches high, and $1 billion would be 358 feet high, which is about the height of the Statue of Liberty. And $1 trillion is 67 miles high. That's well into actual outer space. That's a lot further than Elon Musk went in his rocket last month. And another way to just think about what can we buy for $1 trillion is to look at the infrastructure bill that the Senate just passed last month. And this infrastructure bill had a price tag of $1 trillion. And that $1 trillion can pay for fixing America's roads, bridges, tunnels, airports, electrical grid, for cleaning up toxic waste dumps, bringing high-speed internet to rural areas, and other things. So if we just pause for a minute, that's just $1 trillion, and think about the fact that we have spent $8 trillion in these wars, and think about the opportunity cost of this sum of money. It is a very staggering number and very sobering to really think about the cost of these wars, and that's just the budgetary cost. Now, let me make 3 points about veterans issues. And my father was a World War II veteran. My father-in-law was also a World War II veteran. And so this has been a personal issue for me to track these costs for many years. And it's important to understand that while the fighting for the US in Afghanistan may be over, but the cost of taking care of those who fought is just beginning. So there is always a tail of cost after the fighting ends in a war. The peak year for paying disability benefits for World War I veterans was in 1969. The peak year for World War II veterans benefits was in the 1980s. And we are just now approaching the peak of paying benefits and healthcare for Vietnam veterans. So this is always a long tail. But this time around, the cost will be much higher. I have conservatively estimated it will be at least $2.2 trillion. And this is due to higher survival rates among those who are injured, better and more expensive medical care, better outreach and communication to let veterans know what they are entitled to, positive efforts by the Department of Veterans Affairs to deliver more care in the community, to expand programs for women veterans, for mental health care, and for homelessness, suicide prevention, and a wide range of things. But consequently, there are already 1.8 million post 9/11 veterans who have already been awarded lifetime disability benefits, and in most cases, medical care. And there are hundreds of thousands of others who still have claims pending or haven't filed yet, or who are still in the military and have not been discharged yet. So I estimate that the cost of providing veterans benefits and VA programs to deliver them and medical care will cost from 2.2 trillion to 2.5 trillion. And most of that cost is still ahead of us. And that is a conservative number, which is not counting the claims that may result from exposure to burn pits and the contractors who were injured and who will be showing up on the rolls of Medicare and Medicaid and other government subsidized healthcare program, and not including the long-term economic costs. So my second point is that the number of those who have been directly injured in the Afghanistan and Iraq theaters bears almost no relationship to the number who are entitled to long-term disability benefits. Even though we've heard that there are some 57,000 Americans who have been wounded in these conflicts, there are the number of troops who have returned home with physical conditions like partial hearing loss or severe back problems or respiratory disorders or gastrointestinal disorders, circulatory disorders, mental health conditions that require long-term medical treatment and that are eligible for disability benefits is a much, much, much larger number. So the 1.8 million recent veterans who qualify for disability benefits, we can sort of understand that when we look at the size of the Department of Veterans Affairs budget, which has grown in inflation-adjusted dollars from $61 billion in 2001 to nearly $250 billion today, even at a time when the total number of veterans in the country has declined from 26 million to 18 million. And these numbers really reflect the strain of these wars on those who have served. The troops who supported the efforts in Afghanistan and Iraq and surrounding areas were on average deployed more frequently and exposed to more combat than in previous wars. And according to a survey by the Pew Research, 57% of those who served in combat saw someone being killed or seriously wounded right in their unit. My third point is that the cost of these veterans is still ahead of us, but we still have no clear plan for how to fund this commitment to veterans. Now, in previous wars, we had the tail, but we went into this tail with a different situation, because in previous US wars, as we have heard, and this is pretty much all previous US wars, the War of 1812, the Spanish-American War, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, we raised taxes to help defray the upfront costs. And we raised taxes to high levels. During the Korean War, top marginal rates were raised to 92%. And during Vietnam, top marginal rates were raised to 77%. But this time we cut taxes 3 times in 2001, 2003, and 2017. So nearly all Americans pay much lower taxes now than we did before the wars. And that means we still have to pay interest on the debt as well as paying the long-term costs of veterans care. And what we should have done, and I have testified on this on many occasions, is to set aside funding for taking care of veterans at the same time that we appropriated money for these wars. But at this point, having not done this, we do run the risk of reneging on some of our promises and shortchanging those who fought in these wars. One of the potential solutions that I have proposed is to establish a veterans trust fund, similar to Social Security and Medicare, that would provide funding to pay claims as they are due. And although all tax dollars are fungible to some extent, a trust fund would require the government to keep track of what is owed and create an awareness of the full costs of war and the funding challenge ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. So the economic costs, of course, are staggering, and there are human implications to every dollar, a dollar not spent on healthcare or a dollar not spent on infrastructure. It's very difficult to calculate. So your ability to put it in perspective like that is it's quite sobering. I want to turn now to Maha and talk secondly about the second component of the cost of war project's recent updates about the cost of post 9/11 wars, the human impacts. And the report issued indicates that figure, which is a massive amount of people killed in these wars, of nearly 1 million, itself is conservative and only talks about the people directly killed by violence, not including the indirect impact of the wars, and people being denied medical service or dying through migration or a lack of healthcare or lack of food and so forth. Ma, I want to ask you, how do we think about the actual stories of these people who were killed? We talk about 900,000 people directly killed and many, many more indirectly killed or wounded or losing family members or forced to lose their livelihoods or homes. Can you tell us a bit about how we think about the stories of these people and how we can put a human face to a number which signifies just an incredible amount of suffering?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Murtaza, for moderating this panel, and thank you to the Cost of War for having me. I think the first thing that bears mentioning is how the war on terror has been framed in the first place, right? And the framing is important to contextualize the deaths, both on the side of the Americans, as well as in Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, and so forth, all of the countries that have been targeted by state violence in the form of militarism. So by way of the framing, I want to start with a quote by Donald Rumsfeld, who said in December of 2001, quote, "We did not start this war, so understand responsibility for every single casualty in this war, whether they're innocent Afghans or innocent Americans, rests at the feet of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban." And so why is this quote important? This quote is important because it's assigning blame to all the people who have died in US wars, including civilians, including Afghans, Iraqis, Pakistanis, Syrians, right, at this point, to the people themselves. And when the US does not take responsibility for the deaths that they have caused, then there's, of course, no accountability. And when you think about the different numbers, right? So when the 13 American service members died or were killed a week ago or so, there were many articles that talked about, the headlines were just that the American service members had died. And if you clicked on the article, it would say, and 200 others. Some would, go out of their way to write Afghans. But the headline was really about the 13 American service members who died. So when we look at these numbers, we know there's already a great disparity in the number of civilians killed versus the number of Americans killed. But there's something else that's going on, which is that these deaths are weighted, right? So American deaths are weighted more highly than the deaths of Afghans, Iraqis, and so on and so forth. So when you just see the numbers, we know that there's this discrepancy, but we also know that 13 American service members will be the story, even if, for example, 1,000 Afghans were killed, 1 million Afghans were killed. Because in these wars, Muslims have been totally dehumanized. And so it doesn't matter when they're killed by the US. And if it did matter, right, there would be a different approach, but there hasn't been. And, the thing that I think is also very important is that the war on terror is much more than its militarism and warfare in countries abroad, right? The war on terror has become so invisibilized that it's hard to see what its impacts really are, and how seamlessly and invisibly it has become part of the ways that we live, right? So to me, the war on terror is about immigration restrictions. It's about federal terrorism prosecutions. It's about surveillance. It's about detention and torture. So if we're thinking about the cost of war, the number would be much higher if we were looking at the totality of the war on terror and how it's been manifested, implemented, and executed in all of these different ways. And something I think is also very important is when we talk about the lives of Muslims and civilian casualties, most of the time, the concern is about if we cause too many civilian casualties, will this create hate in the community, in the groups that are being targeted? Will this lead them to become anti-American, and therefore will there be some sort of revenge? So in other words, the concern is not actually about civilian deaths. It's about civilians being killed and the possibility that their deaths will create more violence. So again, when we look at these numbers, it's really important to contextualize this. Yesterday, Biden, said that the war in Afghanistan is over. It has ended, right? Our endless war in Afghanistan has ended. And my question is, for whom did the war end? Did the war end for the Afghans? Has the war ended for Iraqis? What does it mean to end the war? Americans in the US can go back to living a relatively normal life. Meanwhile, we know in the countries that the United States has targeted, there's the aftermath of war, and there will continue to be consequences far after, whenever the United States decides the war is over. The war, in order for a war to actually be over, it has to be over for both sides. But the United States has never cared about the people it's targeting. So to them, they can just extract themselves, the country can just extract itself from the conflict and say the war has ended. I don't think the war has ended for those in the countries the United States has targeted. And when we think about the money, right, we're talking about the cost of war numerically, right? What could this money be used for, right? We could talk about infrastructure needs. We could talk about other social services in the United States. We could also talk about reparations for indigenous communities, for the descendants of enslaved Africans. There are many ways this money could have been used and can still be used. But again, this requires us to understand what the war on terror has been about all of this time. And to me, when I look at the cost of the war that Dr. Crawford talked about, in terms of $8 trillion, to me, that is $8 trillion that have been dedicated to the murder of Muslims. And I see no other way to make this sound any better or different. United States has prioritized the murder of Muslims through the money that they have allocated to these wars. We talk about what will happen to the veterans when they come back, right? Obviously, that's important to address. But what about the scores of people that are left behind in Afghanistan, in Iraq, after a drone attack in Somalia? What about them? Do they get any care? Do they get any compensation? Absolutely not. So what would be the cost of war if that was actually a priority for the United States? And in that light, and subsequent to that, what does it mean to win the war? What does winning actually mean? Is there a threshold of injustice that can be that's on the path to justice? What is that threshold? Do you win a war By killing millions of people, is that how you win a war? And what does that say about the US's priorities? What I think I'll end with is a quote from a 13-year-old Pakistani boy at a congressional hearing in 2013, whose family was targeted by drone strikes. And obviously Pakistan has been continuously targeted by drone strikes in the course of the war on terror. So in the congressional hearing, the young boy named Zubair said, quote, "I no longer love blue skies. In fact, I now prefer gray skies. The drones do not fly when the skies are gray. This is the cost of war. That a young boy, 13 years old, can never look at the sky in the same way that people who haven't been bombarded with violence can." And this is, to me, one of the things that has been totally neglected. This, again, is not ending the war, right? It's ending the war for Americans and exiting and extracting the US from the aftermath of the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, etc. So the last thing I would say, just to, close off my remarks, is really just that we have to understand the narrative and the framing of this war on terror, as I've said several times, in order to really understand what the consequences are. And I think the last thing, I'm sorry to say this, is, yesterday, Biden gave a speech, right, about the war ending. And he talked about how all of these Afghans had been helped by the United States, and no other country could have done what the United States had done. Of course, what was excluded from his remarks is that the United States launched an illegal war on Afghanistan in the first place. So to close, I think we just really need to capture sort of what is at the root of this war. Why is it okay for this many Muslim civilians to die? And why do we continue to prioritize American lives over the lives that have been lost in other countries because of the US's rampant state violence? Thank you.
Thank you, Maha. The past few weeks have been very interesting because, of course, the 20-year anniversary of 9/11 is coming up, and it's a big milestone. It's a time to pause for reflection. And so I was expecting, as a journalist, to see coverage of that vein reflecting upon these events, and I expected some level of public interest. But because the 20-year anniversary happened to coincide with these unbelievable events in Afghanistan, where the US-backed government suddenly collapsed and Taliban took over the country, which seemed to underline the futility of the past 2 decades of war there and all the terrible human and economic costs it's inflicted. So, there's been a lot more public interest in the wars generally, and a lot more, for the time being at least, a lot more focus upon reflecting on what this all meant and what exactly we got for this, or what exactly inflicted on people in Afghanistan or ourselves as a result of waging the conflicts. So my next question for Kathy, I wanted to ask you specifically, as one of the co-directors of this project, watching the recent coverage from Afghanistan, what stuck out to you notably about this moment, and what it says about how we've gotten to this point, and what the sum total of the efforts and losses of the past 20 years?
Thanks for that question, Murtaza. I think unless we have a new way of telling the story about what the United States does when it goes to war, we're going to find ourselves in another Afghanistan. The people of another country are going to find themselves under the bombs of a military campaign. So I think it's really, really important to understand what the media narrative that's emerging in these last few weeks has been. And it's really quite similar to the narrative that's been going on for the whole 20 years of the war on terror. And again, here I'm not talking about the brave and brilliant journalists, many of whom have actually lost their lives covering the war for years. But I'm talking about the television news corporations who have been miniaturizing or ignoring that journalistic work. But those narratives that we find in broadcast news, TV, internet, and news where most people get their news, we really have to question and push back on some of these narratives. First of all, the problem has been that they have ignored the war. The war has been long and complex and horrific and unsuccessful. And that's not a formula for a story that many Americans want to see. So for long stretches of the last 20 years, there was no coverage. In a recent study, the three networks were found to have given an average of just 24 minutes each over the last 5 years on average to coverage of the war in Afghanistan. And we should also note that the Pentagon has increasingly controlled coverage and expanded its demands for secrecy or its withholding of information the American public needs. But in any case, after 2 decades of this kind of really ignoring the war, the media have treated the last couple of weeks as if these long known facts about the war were just discovered surprises. My goodness, look, a war, violence, corruption, and profiteering, blowback, US assets going into the hands of the Taliban. So that's been disturbing to see. Second, as we've just heard, the media is engaged in very selective empathy. Particularly in the last few weeks, there's not been a focus on the minimum of 50,000 dead Afghan civilians and the millions of Afghan people who have been uprooted from their homes and pushed into other countries or into other areas of their country, but on the US soldiers who've been under attack at the airport and the translators and others who helped them. And while that airport evacuation is certainly newsworthy and the US obligation is clear, that focus has been quite obsessive. And when reference is made to Afghans, it's tended to be to Afghan women and girls, but again, not as real humans in some ways, but as figures in a failed savior narrative that's been a key ingredient in the kinds of rationales that have been offered up for the war through these 20 years in order to garner public support. So I think the obsession on focusing on this last rescue narrative has been related to the media and the Pentagon's desire to have a positive story to tell. And it's a story of American exceptionalism and triumphalism. That's a vigilantly protected story that's led even a defeat in war to be covered as a rescue operation or simply an overdue conclusion to the war. I think it's for the most part, the media have not noted that the airport scenes involved the US government trying to solve a problem that it itself had created when it made war and occupation the answer to 9/11. I think in a related vein, the media has long preferred to focus on the domestic political battles that this overseas war has created rather than on the war itself. And this has allowed a set of quite privileged commentators to opine on which party, the Democrats or the Republicans, will lose or gain power as a result of the withdrawal. It provides an opportunity to create a victor in a lost war. A politician or a party can snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. And again, even as those words winning and losing, victory and defeat are obviously myths as well. Critically, the media have provided a platform for another group of privileged commentators, foreign policy pundits, who focus on a dehumanizing rhetoric of national security and geostrategy. So they treat, in talking on Morning Joe or in Fox News, they talk about this as a problem for the United States more than as a human problem for the Afghans caught inside of it. These constant refrains that we hear are dehumanizing. Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires rather than the graveyard of tens of thousands of people, as our report has just shown. People who've lived through personal and social catastrophe. Another refrain that we hear in the media is that the intention of the war was to stop terrorists from finding safe harbor, when in fact, there are now more motivated fighters around the world intent on avenging the US and allied wars and occupations than there were on 9/11. And lest we forget, the man who planned the 9/11 attack was a Saudi who was killed in Pakistan 10 years ago. Dangerously, I think this kind of strategic talk has often repeated the baseless claim that there was not another 9/11 since the October 2001 invasion, because the US sent its military to Afghanistan. And this is the recipe for endless war in just another place. Right? Missing are the experts who would tell the public about research like the Careful Rand study, which found that the use of terror tactics by groups historically has rarely been ended by military means. Rather, it's been ended by addressing grievances, by a simple erosion of public support, or by public attention or policing on the ground when attacks are threatened. There's been a failure to fact check this most serious claim of all, that killing Afghans by the thousands saved American lives. Instead, we've heard from a steady rotation of the very opinion writers and talking heads from think tanks who championed and promoted the war through all of these years, from government officials responsible for pulling the nation into and through it, to the military brass who led us through repeated and deepening failure. And so asking for advice or clear-eyed vision from these all too familiar faces to ask them what went wrong is like asking the doctor who keeps prescribing an array of wrong drugs for yet another prescription. Finally, we've also seen the failure to report on the long tail of war, as Dr. Bilmes has just shown us so vividly. Talking about the war as over, as we've also seen, it's not over for Afghans by any means. Talking about the war as over is simply wrong. The war continues in over 80 countries, and this chapter in Afghanistan will not be over even after the last Afghan who remembers a family member who died in the war is dead, or until the last US veteran with a war wound takes her last disability payment somewhere in early 2100. So I really feel we have to be pushing back on these narrative frames in order that we understand that the numbers and the other analyses that the Cost of War Project has done for all of these 10 years can begin to make sense to people and to shape American foreign policy and domestic policy in ways that pull us out of, again, not just Afghanistan, but endless war.
Thanks, Kathy. We have a few minutes before we switch to audience Q&A, and I had a few questions generally for the panelists, whoever wants to answer, my own curiosity as a reporter. But one thing that always strikes me is that a lot of documentation of the impact of post-9/11 wars, whether it's civilian casualties from airstrikes, whether it's economic costs, and whether it's the total death tolls from the conflict as a whole, are delegated to non-governmental organizations, whether they're by default academics or Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and now Cost of War Project at Brown University. So, I'm very curious, can you tell me how does the US government tabulate these costs, or does it tabulate them? My impression is that there's not any centralized effort to keep track of death tolls or economic costs as a whole of the global war on terrorism. And, the Pentagon has a gigantic budget, as we know from reading this report, and just generally one of the biggest budgets of any institution on earth. And yet they don't seem to have any corresponding figures, or not any well-publicized figures about what their own overall estimates are of the cost of this. Is there a reason that it falls upon work like yours to do this? And what is lost by the government's own unwillingness or inability to tabulate the death tolls and the economic costs of its operations? And I'll leave that question to anyone in the panel who'd like to answer it.
So let me just answer you a little bit on that, Murtaza. First of all, the Pentagon does have an accounting of what Congress has allocated to overseas contingency operations. And my numbers for spending agree with those numbers, except where the Pentagon has, in recent years, made some fuzzier categories called overseas contingency operation spending for the base. So it gets a little murky there. But they do have an accounting, and they do have an accounting of taxpayer cost, but their own numbers often don't agree with each other. And so one part of the Pentagon will say the cost spent so far is this, and another will say cost spent is that. And then, but the larger question you're asking is, why doesn't the government have a larger analysis, and that is the hope that we have, that our work will spur the United States to tally the federal cost in a more comprehensive way. Each department talks about what it's allocated to do, but this has not been a comprehensive analysis in other respects. So that's the point of the project.
Got it. You know, one thing that strikes me is that regarding death tolls, since the war on terror began and the U.S. invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan began, the U.S. military has made a point of not tabulating or not releasing public figures of how many people killed in these operations. Some of the only insights we had in their own estimates have come from disclosures like WikiLeaks and so forth. How do you, this figure of nearly 1 million people, which is documented in the report, can you explain how does this compare with, you know, what it's a very conservative figure. We talk about the indirect death toll. How do we contextualize it with other historical conflicts in Vietnam or the Korean War or World War II, in sense of how the actual impacts on people in the United States and abroad who've been impacted by the conflicts? And I know you mentioned earlier that medical treatment has improved in the United States to a degree, wartime medical treatment to a degree that many people who were wounded in conflict actually survived, but with grave injuries. Can someone speak a bit about, you know, how our efforts on people, non-governmental organizations document this may differ from what the Pentagon does, and how does it fit historically into how bad this conflict has been in comparison to other conflicts?
Let's take the Pentagon counting of injured first and killed. The Pentagon has a definition of combatant that is larger, wider, more inclusive than some non-governmental organizations, and differs in some respects from the Geneva Convention understanding of a combatant or a non-combatant. So the Pentagon disagrees oftentimes with United Nations counting or other organizations counting of casualties that they want to say are military combatants. And then our project takes a lot of different sources to try to get at people who haven't been counted. For instance, categories of individuals who have sort of fallen off the radar. Okay, and then in terms of comparing conflicts in scale through history, World War II killed many, many more millions of people than the post-9/11 war. Vietnam War killed several million people. 50,000 service members were killed in Vietnam. And then there's no accounting of the exact toll of militants or insurgents or Viet Cong on the other side. But we know that previous wars have been larger in terms of their direct impact. But what is different about the post-9/11 wars is that they have, they're not over, and they have destroyed significant quantities of infrastructure, and this means that over time, many more people will die or become ill through indirect causes, loss of access to safe drinking water and so on. And so the reverberating effects of these wars will be very long lasting. And they come in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan on top of previous conflicts.
We have some audience questions, and I have this question which is very good, and I want to throw out. I think the person I have in mind is Maha, but if anyone else wants to answer as well too, I'm welcome. It's from Wagma Mohammadi. She asks, what should today's American public school children learn about the war on terror?
You want me to answer that question?
Or
the next one?
But yeah.
Sure. You know, I actually had met a woman a while ago whose children were in the Virginia public school system. And she told me that every day in September, they learned about the 9/11 attacks, what happened in the aftermath, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously there was a lot of bias towards Muslims that the children were being taught. So, this is not so much about the war on terror, but the ways that American history, right, has been totally rewritten to create and construct an image of the United States as one that is nonviolent, as one that values equality and equity, as one that is democratic and spreads democracy, is generous, is benevolent, et cetera, et cetera. So whether it's war on terror or other parts of US history, it's about telling what that history really is. There are now numerous books, right, that speak to an accurate account of Indigenous history, Black history, Arab history. And so part of it, again, is being critical and giving students the information in terms of how to think about this country's position in the world and what their role is as either Americans, citizens, or non-citizens. It doesn't matter if you're in this country. And I think at this point, especially because many people are now, like the war on terror has become so invisibilized in many ways that it's not often clear what is it to younger students? What does it mean? Now it's normal, right, to go to the airport, you have to take off your shoes, you have to go through the body scanner. So how do we denormalize the things that have become so common and visible in the course of the war on terror? I think there's a lot of ways we can train young students, right, and get them to think critically and also provide these histories that are so important and so neglected, especially when it comes to the war on terror, in which the story has been constructed as the US is the ultimate victim and that nothing it does can ever be illegitimate. It's always justified violence, and that's categorically false.
If I could just add something, there is also a very important lesson for any child who studies the wars in terms of public finance. And that is that how you pay for a war actually determines how much attention it gets. So we have borrowed, I call these wars the credit card wars, because we have borrowed many trillions of dollars to pay for the wars. And the consequence of that, we've been able to do that because of historically low interest rates. But a key consequence of that is that, as Professor Lutz mentioned, the wars have received almost no attention because people have not felt the pain. Apart from, that is to say, people in America, apart from those serving in the military, have not felt the pain of these wars because we haven't paid for them yet. We know sort of vaguely that there is a large credit card bill due, but we have not felt the pain of these wars. And many studies have showed that when people pay taxes, they feel pain, but if they don't feel it. So this has resulted in extremely low oversight over the spending far more than we needed to, rampant profiteering among many of the contractors who have been involved in the war, and minimal attention to the wars in Congress. And the lesson here is that if you don't think about how we pay, then it is easier for wars to continue for a long, long time.
We have more audience questions coming in, excellent ones. But before we get the rest, I just want to know.
Murtaza, if I could just add, for teachers who may be watching and parents who want to think about how we should teach the wars to our children, I think the Cost of War Project on our website have resources for teaching, and we have a campus initiative. But I think some of the work obviously is appropriate for people in high school, children in high school as well. But one of the things that we do know is, from those of us who teach the war, is that we have to underscore and point out, as Dr. Hilal just said, the myths of war that people already have been taught, and take on that notion that war is natural, that war is often American gift to the world rather than an assault. And so I think one of the important things that we can do as teachers is to first of all educate ourselves on what those myths are that are out there, and then again work to do things like put out the kinds of information that Dr. Bilmes was just talking about, and understand that the ways that we fund these wars, the scale of that funding, the fact that the Pentagon and military matters have now absorbed the great majority of the discretionary federal budget over the years, and most people don't know that, adults or children. So I think it's really a very crucial task for the next number of years is for us to educate the public.
Can I add one thing quickly that I should have mentioned, which is that when you're teaching about the war on terror, in order to dismantle the violence and the construction of the United States' violence, whether domestically or abroad, it's really important to center Islamophobia. Young students, right, are consistently and constantly given materials that have bias against many different groups. And what is central to the war on terror is the targeting of Muslims. And there are many ways, right, that Muslims get maligned and targeted, not just in the media, not just by the government, but also in the form of textbooks and other materials that are used to teach. And again, if we want to deconstruct and dismantle the war on terror and people's support for the war on terror, it is fundamental to address intentionally, specifically, and explicitly the role that Islamophobia has played in it.
Thanks, Maha. We have some more questions coming in from the audience, but before, we also have some brief comments from Senator Jack Reed and Representative Cicilline, both representing Rhode Island, where Brown University is located.
Good morning. It is an honor to have the opportunity to speak with you today. I want to thank Drs. Crawford, Lutz, Bilmes, and Hilal for their hard work and commitment to this project, and to Brown University and the Watson Institute for hosting the Cost of War project in Rhode Island and providing researchers and scholars a venue to collaborate on this vitally important topic for the past decade. We all understand that the most traumatic and meaningful cost of war is the loss of human life. So I begin by recognizing the sacrifice of 13 Marines and naval personnel last week, along with many Afghans. This year, the Cost of Wars report coincides with the declared end of our war in Afghanistan. For nearly 20 years, America has devoted troops, training, and support to the country, eventually making it our longest war. Over the course of the conflict, I traveled to Afghanistan 18 times and experienced firsthand the dedication and sacrifice of our service members and diplomats. At the same time, I saw the human, economic, and environmental costs that were often misunderstood at home. Today, 20 years later, it is heartbreaking that the Afghan state America invested so much blood and treasure in has failed, and the Taliban has retaken control. Now as ever, it is important for organizations like the Cost of War and Congress to examine the decisions that brought us here and the costs that follow. As chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, I intend to hold hearings to get answers to these questions. How was our understanding of the resilience of the Afghan forces misjudged? And what can we learn from Afghanistan to conduct more effective and efficient counterterrorism operations in the future? Did our assessments square with the facts and data available? The Cost of Wars report provides an important resource for the public to better understand the budget for the Department of Defense and the cost of its operations, which can be difficult to wade through and understand. I would note that the researchers include in their calculations the war-related spending in the budgets of the State Department and the Department of Homeland Security, not just DoD. We all know that these agencies contribute a great deal to our overseas operations and our national security. I want to particularly express my appreciation to the research team for considering the long-term cost of medical care and disability compensation for wounded warriors. These brave men and women continue to deserve the best care, and we must be willing and ready to invest in it. Again, I hope this report will help inform, educate, and serve as a resource for the public and for my colleagues as we consider these costs going forward. I applaud the team and look forward to their continued analysis of these important issues. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Congressman David Cicilline. I want to thank the Costs of War Project for allowing me to join you all this morning. While we watch the tragic events unfolding in Afghanistan, it is a clear reminder of the enormous human, social, and economic costs incurred from years of war. So as we approach a significant milestone of our nation's involvement in the post-9/11 wars, this is an important moment for us to reflect on the impact that nearly 2 decades of war have had on not just our country, but the entire world. Estimates by the Costs of War Project show that more than 800,000 people have died from the conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, and Pakistan, more than 335,000 of whom were civilians. Hundreds of thousands more have been wounded, many with disabilities that they will live with for the rest of their lives. An estimated 38 million people have been forcibly displaced, exacerbating human rights abuses, poverty, and instability around the world. Thanks to the Costs of War Project, we can also now better understand the enormous financial costs of these conflicts. As your new data shows, the U.S. government has spent or obligated nearly $8 trillion in the post-9/11 wars. That is money that could have sent generations to college, rebuilt our nation's crumbling infrastructure, and supported peace-building missions all around the world. Yet instead, we are left with generations traumatized by decades of violence, the spread of uninhabitable war zones, and further destabilization across the world. While we have lots of work ahead to confront the many challenges around the world, I'd like to end by emphasizing the importance of the work that you do. The Costs of War Project has been crucial in uncovering the real human, economic, and social costs of war, which have allowed us to hold our political leaders accountable and further make the case for strong diplomacy in our nation's foreign policy. I look forward to the vital work that is ahead of us. Thank you again for letting me join you today for this very timely event.
Great. We have another question that came from Twitter, also an excellent question from Ken. I'll give this question to Linda. Ken's asking, I'm wondering how you forecast interest payments, given that rates have been near historic lows for the last 20 years. Those costs would skyrocket if rates even only revert to historical average, let alone levels reached in the early 1980s. And for those who are familiar with the reports, a lot of the part of the cost is based on calculating the long-term cost of servicing the debt, the massive debt that was taken out upon the wars. Linda, can you speak a bit to how this cost may change if interest rates change in the future, or goes back to something above zero and back to what they were historically?
Thank you to the questioner. That's a good question. I think what's important to know about interest rates here is that the extraordinarily low interest rates of since 2008. This is a feature of the length of the wars, not a bug. It wouldn't have been possible without these rates, in my opinion. In 2001, we were paying about 7% of the budget. The place where sort of interest rates hit the national budget is in what percentage of the national budget goes to interest rates. And we were paying about 7%. And in 2008, even as the overall borrowings skyrocketed of the United States, interest rates fell to a 60-year low and have basically stayed low throughout the period. And this meant that by 2018, we were paying less in absolute terms in interest payments than we were at the beginning of the war, purely because of interest rates. So if interest rates had stayed at pre-2008, pre-financial crisis levels, or at historical levels, we would now be paying 15 or 16% of the budget in interest payments. And that would be sufficient to call everybody's attention to the cost of the war. But because we have been able to finance at historically low rates, that attention has not been drawn on because the percentage of the budget that goes to service the debt has stayed constant. Now, the issue around how much of the interest should be attributed to the cost of the war is one that, of course, requires some assumptions around future interest rates. I think that the way the Cost of War project has done it is we've looked at, Professor Crawford can speak to this, is what has already been paid for money that we have already borrowed. If we were to include the full future interest rates, even assuming that interest rates stay low, then the cost of the war would be much higher.
I have a question building upon that too as well, because I know that you've written a paper in the past referring to the wars as credit card wars, and that phrase is very resonant. And can you speak a bit about the political implications of wars, or how they're easier to facilitate and continue or indefinitely when funded by debt, as opposed to wars which in the past were funded by war bonds or increases in taxes and so forth? The perception I get is that forever wars need to be put on credit card because they're able more easily to invisibilize that sense. But I'm curious your perspective on how the funding mechanism of conflict may change the nature and duration of it.
Well, my forthcoming book, The Ghost Budget, looks at this issue, but there have been a number of books by Sarah Krebs and Priscilla Zelinsky and others that have looked at the financing of wars. I call them the credit card wars because we borrowed all the money for these wars, which is the first time in U.S. history that we have financed a U.S. war this way. But what that does is also related to how the president of the time appeals to the public and the need to go to the public about what is happening. So looking back in history, President Roosevelt, President Truman, President Johnson went to the country and said, we have to raise taxes in order to prosecute these wars. President Truman said, we're going to pay as we go. We're not going to saddle our children with the cost of these wars. That really focused attention. If you were paying 92% top marginal tax rates and higher tax rates across the board, that really focused attention. And if one looks back at the State of the Union speeches and other presidential speeches and addresses during previous wars, the presidents were always talking to people and to Congress in their State of the Union addresses and their budget transmission documents saying, we're going to have to do this in order to pay for the wars. But looking back over the last 20 years and 4 presidents, that has virtually never been discussed. So it just makes it so much easier for wars to be kind of out of sight, out of mind. And we have been able to, due to low interest rates, borrow on what are effectively very low interest rate credit cards. So we know that it's going up and up, but at the same time, the interest rate has been so low that we've been able to keep going.
I have a question from Ahad Bashir, and this question is very interesting to me as well too, because as we know, during the Obama administration, and before that, it was disclosed that in its strikes, airstrikes and drone strikes, the U.S. often characterized, or as by default characterized, military-age males killed in certain areas as by default being combatants. There was a story recently in the veteran-centric publication Connecting Vets about 2019 drone campaign in Helmand province in Afghanistan, in which anyone with even a walkie-talkie or suspected of wearing a tactical vest, even under their clothes, would be considered to be a legitimate target, a combatant, even though they're unarmed, and were killed under that program by drones. So this phrase, military-age males, it's sort of distorts the calculations of civilian deaths. This question for Neta, I think, most appropriately. Can you talk a bit about the way the U.S. government has tried to minimize civilian casualty numbers by expanding the scope of who is considered a combatant throughout these conflicts?
Well, these are long wars, and the way to understand them, the treatment of civilians has changed over time. But first, I want to say that it is true that in the post-9/11 wars, the United States has made an unprecedented effort to avoid killing civilians with airstrikes, including with drones. That said, civilians have been killed unintentionally, and this sort of loose definition of a military-aged male means that people are classified as potential combatants who may not be. Another thing that we could think about is not just the airstrikes, but on the ground. In Fallujah, for example, in 2004, the United States told civilians to leave Fallujah so that the US could take the battle there. But it said that males who were 14 and older should remain. Again, the assumption was that they're combatants. So the Obama administration in 2009 or 10, I don't exactly remember when, decided not to think so broadly about military-aged males, and in its planned strikes was looking for something more discerning to tell who was a combatant and a non-combatant. But I think that the bias, unconscious bias, is to assume that a male who looks older and is around a war zone, co-located, as they say, where combatants are, is a person who can be targeted. And in terms of, again, the numbers counting civilian casualties, these calculations, these estimates, these numbers are disputed. For instance, in Afghanistan, the United Nations counts more civilians harmed than the US acknowledges. The same in Iraq, the same in Syria. And this is because of exactly the question of who is a militant or an insurgent or a terrorist, and who's defined as a civilian. And what we're using in the Cost of War Project is the Geneva Convention understanding of non-combatant, that is someone who poses no threat. And that's what the United Nations uses and most international organizations use.
We have many, many good questions. I wish I could ask them all. We're almost out of time, and we have one more video segment to get to, but I want to ask one more question from Shaylee Gupta Barnes of the Cairo Center and Poor People's Campaign. She's asking, does the end of the war in Afghanistan indicate an end to the war on terror? And what role can social movements play in ensuring that the broader militarization of our society is also dismantled, deconstructed, and offering a new paradigm? I'll give this question to anyone who wants to answer it on the panel, and we have about a few minutes left before we move to the next segment.
Somebody else wants.
I'd be happy to take that on. Just to start, I think everybody has probably something to contribute, but I think one of the things that social movements can do is to pursue the democratization of American foreign policy and American domestic policy. In other words, to push back on the power of the corporate interests who have such sway over what happens in Congress, and particularly military contractors who have made so many of the dollars that we're talking about, those trillions of dollars that Dr. Bilmes tried to give you a sense of, are money that flowed not into Afghanistan, but into the pockets of these defense contractors who are on the Hill every day pushing for endless war. So I think that's the democratization in general of our political system is project one. That the anti-racism efforts that the Poor People's Campaign have been engaged in are ones that, as Maha was talking about, really have to be connected to these wars. The Black Lives Matter, Brown Lives Matter movement is one that has to say they matter whether they're inside the United States or outside the United States. And that will be an important part of the campaign to end endless war. Is linking that the domestic needs, both for anti-racism, but also just anti-poverty, seeing all of those dollars that could have been spent in much more functional ways to create more equality in across our country is project number one.
We're about to close, but I think Maha has one brief comment to put before we end our program.
Yeah, I just want to quickly add that again, the war on terror is not over. It's far from over. It's not over in Afghanistan. It's not over in Iraq. And again, we have to ask the question of what does it mean for the war to be over? And in that question, we have to recognize that the United States has used state violence to target countries abroad and cause massive destruction. And the money that the US has spent on the war is one thing. We have to think about how many lives have been lost in this war on terror. And, you know, when we're looking at these numbers, I mean, when you say, for example, again, the 13 American service members died and many Afghans or whatever it is, right? Say the number of Afghans who died. They're not inconsequential deaths. And we have to remember that if we're going to end the war on terror, which again, I don't know what that actually means, we have to recognize that this country has conducted massive murder of Muslim populations. And, you know, the last thing I'll say is part of that is underscoring and focusing on dismantling Islamophobia because it's part and parcel of the war on terror. And lastly, you know, I just to the drones question, I think it's a very important question because the bottom line is whether or not civilians were killed, it didn't matter. There's no accountability whatsoever. Obama could have restricted how it was counted or made an effort, right? But that's not how, yeah. So the deaths have become inconsequential. And in my mind, the last thing I'll say is it's not about unconscious bias. To me, this is about bias completely. It's explicit Islamophobia that drives the war on terror, and we need to remember that.
Thanks, Mom. Thank you all our panelists, and thank you for the Cost of War Project for putting this event together and also putting this report together. I think that 20 years after 9/11, it's no better time to reflect on the unbelievable, incalculable in some sense cost, but which can be tabulated in numbers which don't really give the full human impact. But you know, the government has not made the effort to publicize or clarify to the public the cost of its endeavors, military endeavors in Iraq, Afghanistan, elsewhere. So efforts like this are really one of the only chances we have to help the public understand what's been lost after 20 years. To conclude, we have statements from Representative Ro Khanna about the Cost of War Project, and we turn to those now.
Hi, I'm Congressman Ro Khanna. I want to thank the Cost of War Project for the extraordinary work you do in documenting the unacknowledged cost of wars. We have been at war for almost 20 years after 9/11, in Afghanistan, in a war that had no clear mission, and in Iraq, in a war that had no clear strategic purpose. Many people don't know the extraordinary toll these wars take, not just the cost of deploying troops, not just the cost in terms of human lives, but the cost in terms of benefits and in terms of our obligations for decades to come. My team and I rely on the cost of war to give us an accurate sense of how much money is being drained because of these endless wars. I read somewhere that had we not stayed in Afghanistan for 20 years, we would have had enough money to provide a free college education or vocational school for every American in this country. Thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for your service in helping us understand the true costs. You are a resource to our office.